I couldn't breathe when the doctor said 640 pounds. She wrote it down like weather on a chart, but every digit hit harder than a hammer. She told me 90 days, 45 pounds, or no surgery, and whispered, "You may not see Christmas." And that was only the beginning. 640 pounds, 90 days, or no surgery. The words fell heavy in the small exam room, sharper than the ticking wall clock and louder than the faint baseball game murmuring from the radio at the front desk. Dr. Helen Brooks spoke evenly, as if delivering weather or facts from a chart. Yet each syllable struck Dan Whitaker like a hammer. He sat hunched on the exam table, paper sheet crinkling under his weight. At 55, he looked older, skin pale from years of poor sleep, chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. The fluorescent light showed no mercy, outlining the sweat on his brow and the folds of his body beneath the loose shirt. Brooks lowered her glasses, scanning the chart again, though she didn't need to. "You're at 640, she said, her voice carrying the same tone she had used for countless patients before, firm, but not unkind. "If you don't drop at least 45 pounds in the next 90 days by December 20th, you will not be cleared for surgery." The number echoed 640. For years, Dan had avoided it, stepping around scales like they were traps. Today, there was no escape. He tried to smile, a reflex he'd used on waitresses and neighbors to soften moments. "I've lived this way for years," he muttered half to himself. "I'll be fine." Brooks leaned forward. She had seen the deflections before, the jokes, the excuses, the fragile walls patience built. "You're out of time, Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly. "If you don't meet this, you may not see next Christmas." Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind carried dry leaves against the clinic windows. A poster about heart health hung crookedly on the wall behind Brooks, its bright reds and blues almost mocking in their cheer. The smell of antiseptic lingered sharp in Dan's nose, mixing with the sour taste rising from his throat. His pen scratched the follow-up appointment form, hand trembling enough that his signature wobbled. He handed the clipboard back without meeting her eyes. Brooks softened just slightly. "We'll see you in a month. Think about what we talked about. Take small steps." Her words hovered between instruction and plea. Dan pushed himself off the table, breath wheezing with the effort. His reflection ghosted in the polished cabinet glass, a man who once worked long shifts at the plant, who once carried his daughter on his shoulders at county fairs, now reduced to numbers on a page. He turned away quickly. The hallway to the exit felt longer than before. Each step carried the weight of the ultimatum, heavier than his body itself. Nurses passed by with patient charts, voices lowered, respectful but brisk. No one looked directly at him. The automatic doors opened with a sigh, and the cold Ohio air rushed in. On the other side of town, in his living room, a stopwatch lay on a dusty shelf. It hadn't ticked in decades, left untouched since the days he coached Little League. The glass face dulled, but still caught slivers of light when the sun angled through the blinds. It waited silent, a relic of a man Dan barely remembered. He tugged his coat tighter as he crossed the parking lot. His pickup truck leaned on worn shocks, rust lining the fenders. He climbed in slowly, breath-heavy chest still echoing with the doctor's words. 640. The number chased him, settled in the seat beside him like an unwelcome passenger. He stared through the windshield at the wind lifting scraps of paper across the lot. The radio in his truck was stuck on the local AM station, a preacher's voice cutting through static. Time is the one thing we cannot buy back. Dan twisted the knob off quickly, silence swallowing the cab. He sat there, fingers gripping the wheel until his knuckles paled. The words pressed against his chest, 45 pounds, 90 days, December 20th. Too much, too late. Then, as if rehearsed from years of avoiding reality, the old habit returned. He exhaled, forced a crooked smile into the rearview mirror, and muttered, "Next month. I'll start next month." The phrase hung in the stale air, thin and fragile, the kind of bargain a man makes not with a doctor, but with himself. The kind of bargain that had failed him before. He turned the key, the engine coughed to life, and he pulled out of the lot into the falling dusk, carrying both the ultimatum and his denial like twin shadows. The first walk ended after just 50 steps. Dan Whitaker had laced up an old pair of sneakers that had sat under his bed for years, dust clinging to the faded laces. The November air was sharp, smelling faintly of burning leaves from somewhere down the block. He told himself it would be a short loop one time around the block just to prove to Dr. Brooks and maybe to himself that he could start. The first 10 steps felt almost normal. His breath steadied the sidewalk crisp beneath his soles. By 20, his thighs burned. By 40, his chest heaved like bellows. At 50 steps, his vision blurred, and he sank down onto the cold concrete steps of a neighbor's porch, gripping the railing to steady himself. His sweatshirt clung damp to his back, and every inhale rasped louder than the wind whistling through the bare trees. He muttered 50's better than nothing, but the words came out between gasps. Across the street, a pair of kids raced by on bicycles, their laughter bright slicing against his ragged breathing. He lowered his eyes, not wanting to be seen like this. A beat-up sedan slowed as it rolled past. Eddie Malone leaned an elbow out the window, grinning. Eddie had been Dan's drinking buddy for years, the man always ready with a six-pack and a laugh. "Beer will fix it, buddy," Eddie called, voice a blend of joke and invitation. The car rumbled off, leaving behind the faint echo of music and the smell of fried food. Dan shook his head, sweat stinging his eyes. He knew Eddie meant no real harm, but the words dug in all the same. Another shortcut back to the same old habits. He forced himself up, leaning hard on the railing, and shuffled home slower than he'd left. Later, as daylight drained from the sky, he sat in the diner where Eddie often dragged him. The waitress topped off his coffee without asking, steam curling above the chipped mug. Pumpkin pie sat under a glass dome at the counter, cinnamon sweet in the air. Eddie occupied the next stool, still smirking, tapping a coin on the counter before leaving $2 bills under his plate. "See you tomorrow, big guy," he said, tone too casual, too dismissive. The waitress called after them both. "Stay warm now." Dan carried the warmth of the coffee back outside, but it faded quickly in the wind. He climbed into his pickup chest, tight legs aching from that aborted walk. That night the phone rang. Grace's number flashed on the screen. He hesitated before answering, hope rising that maybe this time she would sound like the little girl who used to call him my giant teddy bear. Her voice was careful, measured. "Dad, I'm not sure about the wedding invite. You need to focus on your health first." The words sliced deeper than Eddie's jokes. He wanted to argue, to tell her about the 50 steps, about the sweat that still clung to his skin, proof he was trying. But the line was silent, except for her soft sigh. I just, I don't want to see you collapse in front of everyone. He managed a low, I understand, though he didn't. The call ended with the hollow click that left his living room quieter than before. He wandered outside to the porch swing, its chains squeaking. As he lowered himself onto the wooden slats, the porch light above flickered in the wind, casting shadows across the yard. He rocked slowly, the swing creaking chest heavy. The night smelled of damp earth and faint wood smoke, but he barely noticed. His daughter's voice lingered louder than anything, not sure about the invite. He pressed a hand against his chest, not in pain this time, but in weight, as if disappointment itself had mass. 90 days stretched in front of him like a road he could never finish. The wind shifted, rattling the mailbox at the edge of the yard. With a metallic clack, something slid into it. Another bill-thick envelope landing among the others. Dan stared into the darkness, the porch swing moaning under him. How many steps could a man take before the road swallowed him whole? He didn't know. All he knew was that tonight, 50 had been too much. At the diner counter, two men whispered loud enough to be heard. Sunday morning rush filled the place, clinking forks and the hiss of bacon on the griddle. The little bell over the door had rung non-stop for an hour, and the air was thick with the smell of apple pie and burnt coffee. Families crowded into booths, church coats hung over chair backs. Dan Whitaker sat at the counter, shoulders hunched, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He kept his eyes on the swirling surface of the coffee, but the voices carried. Insurance waste. That's all he is, one man said, shaking his head as if speaking of some distant statistic instead of the man 3 stools away. The other chuckled low, adding doctor's nightmare. They'll spend more keeping him alive than he's worth. The words cut sharper than the metal fork Dan gripped under the counter. His knuckles whitened. He thought of saying something. But Eddie Malone was perched beside him, already smirking at the gossip like it was nothing more than a bad joke. Eddie gave a half laugh, nudged Dan with his elbow and muttered, "Don't mind them." But Eddie's chuckle, even half-hearted, felt like betrayal. Dan kept still, jaw tight. A storm behind his silence. At the end of the counter, an older man leaned toward his companion and whispered something different. I knew his daddy once. Strong man. His voice was softer, tinged with memory. For a moment, Dan's eyes flickered, a ghost of the past brushing against him. The thought of a stopwatch he once carried at the ball field slipped into his mind, its weight still familiar, though it had been decades. He shook it away quickly. He paid his tab with bills that smelled faintly of his old jacket, left a tip folded under the mug, and slipped out into the wind. The waitress called after him, "Have a blessed day." Outside, the town moved with its usual rhythm. He drove the pickup to the post office where the line curled out the door. A sign taped crookedly near the entrance declared in red marker, "Last day for Christmas shipping." Carols played from an old radio behind the counter, tinny and slightly off-key. Dan clutched a small cardboard box, the corners taped neatly. Inside was a scarf Grace once admired in a catalog, one he had managed to order on credit. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, breath labored, watching mothers juggle children and retirees chatting about holiday plans. No one looked at him. In the line, he was just another man waiting, but the weight of the whispers from the diners still clung to him. The box grew heavy in his arms, though it weighed almost nothing. He pictured handing it to Grace, Imagined her smile, imagined being more than an afterthought in her busy life. But in the back of his mind, he heard the diner voices again: insurance waste, not worth it. By the time he reached the counter, his shirt was damp with sweat, his breath ragged. He slid the box forward, forcing a polite nod as the clerk said, "Stay warm out there." Later that afternoon, the clinic waiting room smelled of antiseptic and lemon floor cleaner. A small TV in the corner showed highlights of Saturday's game. The crowd roared, tinny and faint. Dan sat hunched in a chair too small for him, eligibility form clutched in his hands. When the nurse called his name, he hauled himself up and followed her down the hall. Dr. Helen Brooks sat behind her desk, papers stacked neatly. She adjusted her glasses and handed him a new sheet, crisp and printed in bold letters. "This is your pre-op eligibility," she said, her tone steady. "Lose 45 pounds in 90 days. Stand unassisted for 30 seconds. BMI under 35. Deadline December 20th. If you don't meet these numbers, you will not have surgery." Dan's fingers shook as he folded the paper once, then again, before sliding it into his jacket pocket. The fabric felt heavier with it. Inside, like carrying a stone. Brooks studied his face, saw the silence pooling there, and decided not to fill it with empty encouragement. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice quieter but sharper. "If you don't meet these numbers, you may not live to see Christmas." The words landed harder than any diner whisper, harder than Eddie's laughter, harder than Grace's distance. They were final, without cushion, a line drawn on the calendar in red ink. He nodded stiffly, throat dry, and stood to leave. That evening, back at his house, the porch light flickered weakly against the night wind. Bills stacked on the table near the door, unopened. As he passed through the living room, his eyes lifted to the shelf where the old stopwatch sat under a layer of dust. The faint glow from the porch light caught on its glass face a tiny glimmer in the dark room. Dan stopped in his tracks. He stared at it for a long moment, remembering the weight in his hand, the steady tick that once measured sprints and stolen bases. He reached toward it, then pulled his hand back. The ultimatum pressed tighter around his chest than any belt or strap. 90 days, 45 pounds, December 20th. Numbers that felt less like goals and more like a noose. He sank into the porch swing wood, creaking beneath him, and let the night settle heavy on his shoulders. The stopwatch felt heavy in his palm, though it weighed almost nothing. Dan Whitaker hadn't touched the old thing in decades. The brass casing was tarnished, and the glass face bore a faint crack across the corner, but the second hand still quivered when he pressed the side button. He slipped it into his pocket that Sunday afternoon, as if carrying proof that time could be measured, held, maybe even redeemed. Outside Springfield's church square bustled with late November air. The last of the maple leaves skittered along the sidewalk, dry and brittle. The smell of pot roast and turkey drifted from long folding tables already laid out for the evening potluck. Steam rose from coffee urns, and the hum of neighbors' voices floated under the clang of pots and the faint harmony of the choir warming up inside. Dan's truck pulled into the gravel lot with a crunch. He eased himself out, bracing on the door frame, the stopwatch clutched tightly in his hand. His breath fogged in the cold. Across the lot, Grace stood near the entrance, her coat buttoned against the chill, talking quietly with a pair of women from the congregation. She glanced his way, but didn't wave. He started forward, each step deliberate. The church steps loomed only yards ahead, but might as well have been a mountain. His knees trembled as he reached the first riser. He planted his foot, pulled his weight up, and his breath fractured. The second step burned deeper. He clutched the railing, veins standing out in his hands. A man carrying a casserole paused nearby, setting it down to offer steadying hands. "Take it slow, brother," he said, eyes kind. Dan nodded, grateful, but shook his head as if refusing to be lifted. This climb had to be his. By the third step, sweat dripped down his temples despite the cold air. He pulled the stopwatch from his pocket thumb, slick with moisture. With a trembling inhale, he pressed the button. The ticking filled his ears, louder than the choir inside. He straightened his spine, released the railing, and stood unassisted on the broad step. His body swayed once, twice, before settling into a fragile balance. 10 seconds passed. His knees shook, his chest heaved, but he did not fall. The second hand swept forward. From the corner of his eye, he saw Grace step away from the group. She crossed the landing quietly, her heels clicking against the stone. When she reached him, she laid a gentle hand on his arm. Her eyes shone not with pity, but with a soft, fierce pride. Her voice was low, meant only for him. "Dad, you're not out of time." Dan swallowed, unable to answer. "I've been leaving those meals on your porch," she continued, breath misting in the cold. "I saved your slot with Dr. Brooks. I couldn't just watch you fade." The words crashed through him more powerfully than the ultimatum sheet, more powerfully than the diner gossip. Grace had not abandoned him. She had been there quietly, faithfully carrying him when he thought he was alone. The stopwatch ticked on. 30 seconds passed. His legs quivered, but held. Around them, the church doors opened, releasing a swell of choir rehearsal voices, rising in layered harmony, spilling into the crisp evening. The sound wove around Dan like a blanket, fragile but warm. Neighbors looked on from a respectful distance, murmuring but not intruding. Some smiled, some simply nodded. The church steps had become a stage, and for once Dan did not shrink from being seen. He pressed the stopwatch again, halting the second hand at 32 seconds. The small click echoed in his chest like victory. He exhaled, shoulders dropping. Grace squeezed his arm tighter. "You're stronger than you think," she said. Dan's eyes blurred with sweat and something more. He stood there on the stone steps, chest heaving, tears catching cold on his lashes. For the first time in years, his eyes were lit not by shame or fear, but by a spark of hope. The church bells struck the hour, reverberating across the square. The sound carried through the crisp air, blending with the laughter from the potluck tables and the hum of the choir. Dan released a long, unsteady breath. He turned his head toward Grace, wanting to speak, to tell her everything the stopwatch meant, everything her words meant. But the lump in his throat silenced him. All he could do was meet her gaze, steady, unflinching, as the bell tolled again. For the first time in years, the scale moved in the right direction. Dan Whitaker gripped the cold rail beside the clinic's standing scale, bracing himself. The nurse adjusted the sliders, nudging them past numbers that once seemed immovable. The balance arm finally settled 50 pounds lighter than it had 6 weeks ago. Dan blinked at the bar, heart stuttering with disbelief. 50 pounds gone, not everything, not the whole battle, but enough to matter, enough to mean the ultimatum hadn't swallowed him whole. Dr. Helen Brooks stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand, her posture softer than their first meeting. She scanned the numbers, then looked up, eyes steadier now, but touched with warmth. "You did it," she said simply. "You'll see Christmas." The words cracked something inside him, and his knees wobbled, but this time from relief, not exhaustion. He exhaled a breath that seemed to empty years of shame. Brooks signed the surgical clearance with a firm hand, then pressed the page into his palm. "This doesn't erase the road ahead, but it means you've earned the chance to walk it." Dan stared at the bold lettering, approved ink gleaming under the fluorescent light. His throat closed and he swallowed hard, clutching the paper as if it might vanish. His eyes burned and he had to glance away before the tears spilled. Grace stood just inside the doorway, her scarf still dusted with the December frost. She watched her father, her lips curved in the faintest smile, no judgment left in her gaze. Dan caught her eyes and nodded once, a thank you larger than words. Outside the clinic, the sky was pale and sharp winter clouds hanging low. He stepped onto the sidewalk, paper folded carefully into his jacket. Eddie Malone leaned against his sedan nearby, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. For a long beat, Eddie said nothing. His usual grin was gone, replaced with something quieter, almost respectful. He finally muttered, "Call me if you need a ride." Then he pushed off the car and walked away without another word. It wasn't much, but for Eddie, it was as close to an apology as Dan would ever hear. And maybe that was enough. Later that afternoon, Dan sat at the familiar counter of the diner, steam curling from a fresh cup of coffee. The waitress filled it with her usual practice grace, sliding the pot back onto the warmer. She lingered a moment, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Proud of you, hon. Have a blessed day." The words, simple as they were, lifted him more than any medicine. Around him, the diner hummed with conversation, an older couple discussing their grandkids, a man reading the Sunday paper. One of the regulars caught Dan's eye and tipped his head in a quiet nod, a small gesture of recognition. The scent of apple pie wafted from the counter, cinnamon and sugar mingling with the bitter coffee. For the first time in years, Dan didn't taste failure in the air. He tasted possibility. He left a $5 bill under the cup, more than the cost of the refill, and pushed open the door. The winter air cut sharp, but it felt clean in his lungs. His boots crunched on the salted sidewalk as he made his way back to the pickup. At home, twilight settled fast. He pulled into the driveway where the porch light glowed steady against the December dusk. He climbed the steps slower, but not defeated, and set the folded approval sheet on the kitchen table. Then he turned to the wall calendar pinned beside the fridge. With a thick red marker, he circled the date, December 20th. The square glared back at him bright and bold, a line he would cross, not with dread, but with a measure of pride. Dan stood there for a long moment, looking from the circled date to the porch light, spilling warmth through the window. The house no longer felt like a waiting room for failure. It felt faintly like the beginning of a second chance. December nights came early, but the porch light burned steady. Springfield lay quiet under a thin film of frost rooftops outlined in silver by the glow of holiday lights. Wreaths hung on doors, garlands twined across porch rails, and the faint echo of carols drifted from the church a few blocks away. In Dan Whitaker's yard, the flag on the pole swayed gently in the winter breeze. The porch swing creaked softly as Dan settled into it, wrapped in a heavy coat. A mug of hot tea warmed his hands, steam curling into the night air. The porch light above cast a golden circle, steady and calm, a promise that the darkness didn't own him anymore. On the small side table, the old stopwatch rested, its cracked glass catching the reflection of the Christmas lights strung along the eaves. For years, it had been a silent relic. Tonight, it was simply there no longer, a weight of guilt, but a quiet witness to how far he had come. Grace stepped onto the porch, her scarf trailing a faint scent of cedar. She lowered herself beside him, her hand slipping naturally into his. No hesitation, no distance, just warmth. They sat in silence for a while, watching the frost form on the mailbox at the curb, listening to the faint laughter of neighbors finishing their potluck down the street. The night didn't demand words, but eventually Grace spoke. "I want you at the wedding, Dad." Her voice was soft but certain. Dan turned to look at her. The porch light caught in her eyes, and for the first time in years, he saw no barrier between them. His throat tightened, but not from fear. He gave her hand a squeeze, letting the silence answer. A buzz from his phone broke the stillness. He fumbled it out of his pocket and pressed play on the new voicemail. Dr. Helen Brooks' voice came through, calm and warm. "See you on the 20th. Proud of how far you've come." The words folded gently into the night air, less a warning now and more a benediction. Dan leaned back on the swing, exhaling into the cold. The sound of church bells rang faint in the distance, drifting across the frosted roofs. The melody carried a sense of time, both passing and redeemed. Across the street, a neighbor waved, bundled in a plaid coat, calling "Merry Christmas, Dan." Dan lifted his hand in return, the gesture simple but steady. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't invisible. Grace rested her head lightly on his shoulder. Together they watched as the porch light glowed against the dark, a small but steadfast flame. The stopwatch stayed on the table untouched. It didn't need to mark seconds anymore. Tonight, time wasn't an enemy. It was a gift. And in that quiet, with the swing rocking and the tea cooling in his hands, Dan Whitaker was finally seen not as a number on a scale, not as a burden whispered about in diners, but as a man with another chance, seated beneath the steady glow of his porch light.